Part four of our elements of handicapping of the Belmont Stakes is pace. And those of you who know about this, what we're going to be looking at is the final fraction, the average pace, and the sustained pace. And the final fraction is the third pace call for each horse's last race. Then the average pace is, or the sustained pace rather, is the combination of the second and third pace calls averaged out, and that's an indication of how a horse carries their speed throughout. And then the average pace, of course, is pretty self-explanatory. That's the early pace, which is the second pace call, plus the sustained pace, and then averaged out to get on average all the way through the race, how the horse carries their speed. So these are the averages or the pars for the 10 horses running in the Belmont Stakes. So the final fraction came out at 51.67. That's feet per second. And average pace is 54.37, and the sustained pace is 53.48. Then our final factor is we're going to use our subjective progression to determine from the pace numbers whether or not there'll be a move forward or a move back, and it goes on a +2 to -2 scale. And those of you who have seen our other postings should be familiar with that. The other thing we're going to look at is one of the things we record is percentage energy. And what this is how much energy a horse is using from the second pace call to the end of the race. So basically you take the second pace call and divide it by the second and third pace calls averaged, or combined rather, and that gives you the percentage, how efficiently the horse is running. And I've given you a chart here to give you an idea of what these mean. So you can see for a horse who likes to run on the lead, 53% at the midway point of the race or at the second pace call is generally considered pretty good. You see between 52 and 54% is about where they want to be. A stalker or early presser is about 52.5, roughly between 51.5 and 53. A pace presser or like a mid-pack stalker, 52%. And then finally a closer at 51%. So obviously the lower the percentage, let's say a horse is an early presser and his percentage energy is at like 50%, that means that horse runs extremely efficiently. So it's a way to gauge how efficiently a horse runs and obviously how much they'll have in the tank left. So just a little added thing to look at for each horse. We'll start with Seize the Gray, the Preakness winner, and we'll take a look at the Preakness, and these are the final fractions you can see. And you see that the final third pace call was 51.48. I'm sorry, that 9 shouldn't be there. And that was minus 0.19 feet off of the average. So roughly about average. And then you see the early pace, which is, again, the second pace call. The average and the sustained pace are a little bit below average. So the subtotal score is minus 2.41. That's adding the third fraction, the average pace, and sustained pace together. You see the percentage energy for a horse who generally runs, runs up near the lead. We know in the Preakness he went wire to wire, but at 51%, that's extremely efficient for a front runner. And then we've projected out, based upon the pace calls, what the time would look like for a 1.25 miles. So you see 47 1, 111 4, and 203 1 would roughly be, if Seize the Gray ran as he did in the Preakness, that would be his final time. Progression-wise, I'm gonna Adam Hoyt back for the coach. I think this horse is in good form, and it could just be that this one is getting good at the right time and can continue onward. I don't think the distance is going to be a problem at 1.25 miles for Seize the Gray. The concern is a little bit, of course, there's been a lot of running since this horse debuted at 3. But, I think this horse might be a little sturdier to handle it and seems to have a top end that could very well get this race done. And again, this race doesn't have a lot of pace, and it is would be not surprise me in the slightest be on the rail if Seize the Gray tries to steal it again on the front end. So Seize the Gray is a horse I think that from the pace numbers is a pretty decent fit. We look at Resilience and ran the Derby was visually a really nice race. You look at the pace numbers, not quite that good, but I will say this. When you look at the pace fractions of horses before the Derby, they generally tend to be, the final fraction tends to be a lot better than it is in the Kentucky Derby. And you'll see with some of the others. And I think that mainly has to do with the size of the field. It's a big race, the keyed up, a lot of factors involved in it. So 49.78 normally would not cut it. And it's indicative as that, Resilience was flattening out in the stretch with them. So that's a minus 1.89. With perhaps a smaller field, Resilience could possibly run a little better than that. But it really didn't look like, to me, the issue more than anything else is just the speed and trying to keep up with faster horses. And that would be demonstrated by the pace numbers. You see they're a little bit below average. And so the subtotal score is a minus 4.17. And the troubling thing is the percentage energy is a little on the high side. And what I think that indicates is, again, as I mentioned with the pace numbers, this is a horse who's maybe trying to keep up with faster horses and working a little harder than he should. So you look at the projected final time, 2:04 and 4, probably isn't going to win the Belmont, and probably won't be terribly close. Belmont has expressed some reservations about whether or not Resilience wants 1.25 miles, but he did enter him in the race, and it kind of was unexpected. So perhaps that question has been answered for him. I like Resilience as a horse. I just think he's probably a little outclassed in this race, and so he gets a -1 from me for progression for a total score of minus 5.17. So we come to Mystic Dan, the Derby winner, finished second in the Preakness. And we look at his Preakness pace fractions, and they're not bad. They're actually pretty good for when you consider he had just run in the Kentucky Derby. I think they're right about on line. The question I have is just getting that extra 16th of a mile for the third straight classic distance race. I know I've harped on this quite a bit, but I do think it's a valid concern with Mystic Dan. You do see his numbers are roughly around average, a cut below, and he gets a minus 1.57. One thing that works in his favor a great deal, I think, is you see the percentage energy of 51.13%. That's very efficient moving. And I don't think that's a surprise with Mystic Dan. You look at his projected time at 1.25 miles, 48 and 1, 112 and 3, 203 and 3. I think that's kind of borderline, and that would be dependent upon having perhaps a more reasonable pace number, which very well may happen in this race. I can kind of go either way with Mystic Dan. I lean towards tossing just because of the third straight race. And I just not certain that this is what this horse wants. But he is intriguing, and he may be a use for me if I can get a little bit better value. The Wine Steward, this horse tries hard every time. And what I've done is, some of you who saw the contender profile, to give you an idea of how this horse is running, I've just included his last 3 races, including one at 2 years old, the Breeders' Futurity. We look at the Lexington and the Peter Pan, and you notice in the Peter Pan he had a marked improvement over what he had run prior. But that is at 1.125 miles, and so it... But as we know from those 1.125 mile Derby prep races, horses who run generally around a 53 for the third fraction means that they're going to get the distance. And I think the Wine Steward will get 1.25 miles. The concern is more about the speed. You see that his numbers are above average, and he ends up with a plus 3.02, 51.36. He moves pretty efficiently, and you look at his projected time, and that would be very solid, and that's extremely competitive within this group. The issue, of course, is the speed and whether or not he can run at the top end to win this race. I'm not overly certain. I think, but his pace numbers do line up, and which would tell you that he is at the very least, competitive within this group. So now we come to Antiquarian, and you see the Peter Pan Stakes. Now, I will note that this horse had been showing some progression in his prior couple of starts, and the Peter Pan, he put it all together with a really excellent race. And you see that 53.27. That's an excellent fraction for a mile and an eighth, and it does tell you that the mile and a quarter is probably a distance he's going to get, and his pedigree indicates that, so we're not going to worry about it. You do see the average and sustained pace are a little bit above average, so he's at plus 2.14. He moves very efficiently at 51.16%. And that projected time is extremely competitive here. I think this horse is ready to take another move forward, and I'm very encouraged by seeing that last pace fraction. And he will have to get faster to deal with the likes of Sierra Leone, but I do think it's in his wheelhouse. And Antiquarian, I think, pace-wise, matches up pretty well. Now we come to Dornoch, and boy, he's just feeling like a redheaded stepchild lately, because everybody just loving to beat up on this horse. Obviously, the Derby was an extremely subpar effort, but if you consider that Resilience ran a 49 and change third fraction, the 48.19 doesn't look that bad now, and it is significantly below average, as are the average pace and sustained pace, and consequently he gets a minus 6.65. It just wasn't a good race for him. The percentage energy is very troubling at 53.22%. That is bordering on inefficient, even for a horse who likes to run up near the lead. When you look at the final time, obviously it's not going to be very good. I think this horse can run better than that, but there's a lot of other things that bother me about Dornoch, and I think he'll probably run a better race in the Derby. It'd be hard for him not to, but will it be competitive for the Belmont? I'm not overly certain, and his pace numbers really haven't demonstrated it all the way through the Derby trail. So now we come to Protective, the world's greatest maiden, as Todd Pletcher put it, or America's best maiden, I think he said. We take a look at the Peter Pan, and if you compare it to the Wood Memorial and the last maiden special weight he ran, you see improvement steadily throughout. Now, I noted in the contender profile, that 58.09 for that maiden, I did the math on that I don't know how many times, and I just can't figure out how they came up with that number or how we arrived at it. He was just really smoking the last 16th of a mile. That's the only thing I can gather. The 50.02 is what it would be at a mile. So it is a horse who was moving late, but it's just not realistic, and that's why I put it parenthetically. You do see the 52.74 and the 52.84 for third fractions. That's exactly the kind of progression you want to see. And I thought Protective ran a nice Peter Pan, and he was a little more forwardly engaged. And he has the look to me like a horse who is on the right track. Whether or not it's good enough in the Belmont, probably not. It doesn't look like speed-wise he's going to factor. But if you do look at his percentage energy, pretty efficient mover, and his projected time off of a mile and an eighth race, as you might expect, is competitive. So Projective to me is a horse you definitely want to think about using underneath at odds, and I think he will take a step forward, so he gets a +1, but I don't think it'll be significant enough to be a tremendous factor in the race, and certainly not as a win candidate, but I think you can comfortably use him. So now we come to Honor Marie, and prior to the Derby, I really liked this horse a lot. His pace fractions were just dynamite, and it looked like he was ready to run a big Derby, and he had about as bad a trip as a horse can have. And consequently, his numbers reflect that, particularly the third fraction. This is a horse who was normally a closer, and his early fraction indicates that. The middle fraction is the thing that was a little troubling. Because he had trouble, I think maybe he had to work a little harder than he wanted to, and that would correspond with a third fraction that's a little on the light side. His average pace is okay, and his sustained pace is a little bit below average, so he gets a -2.85. I'm going to give him a 1 point as a horse, I think can run better than that, unencumbered. But he is a late runner, and he's going to have Sierra Leone to deal with as well. The percentage energy also is very troubling for a late runner. 52.99 is just very high, and it gives you the indication that he had to be used early to overcome some trouble. So maybe with a cleaner trip, it's more realistic. But there's a couple of things that give me some reservations about Anna Marie, and I'm just not as high on him as I was in the Derby. And at this point, I can kind of go either way with him. So now we come to Sierra Leone, the prohibitive favorite, and deservedly so. We look at his Kentucky Derby, and you see he had kind of similar fractions to Anna Marie. Had to be used a little bit in the second fraction, but he had enough in the tank left to close in and nearly win the race. And obviously we know if he hadn't lugged in, he probably would have won if he just kept straight. He had a good third fraction. Again, because it's the Derby, he normally was running at around 53 or better. So it's given the Derby is just such a wild race, it's not a surprise that it was a little lower. I expect it to be. I don't expect the mile and a quarter is going to be a problem, obviously, for Sierra Leone, and I think he'll run a race that's competitive at the least. You see his average and sustained pace. The average is okay. Sustained pace a little on the light side, a little bit below average. So he's right around that plus 0.94. He's a little bit above average. Again, the percentage energy is troubling, but it is the Kentucky Derby, and you got to negotiate a 20-horse field. So I'm not overly surprised to see it a little higher than it ought to be for a closer. I think it'll level off in the Belmont with a smaller field. The projected time is 2:03 and 1, but that is projected on a mile and a quarter, whereas the other ones it is a mile and an eighth. So you have to remember that, and those are about the fractions that were this year's Kentucky Derby, or the final time anyway. So we know he can get the distance, and I think fully expect him to run a big race. So I'm adding 2 back. That gives him a plus 2.94. So now we come to mind frame, and if you haven't seen the contender profile, these pace numbers are going to blow your mind. Running at a mile and a 16th, that first fraction, 53.68, is about right. But look at those last two, 55 and 55. That basically means he was allowed to just do whatever he wanted on the front end, and nobody went to get him. And that's the kind of race it was. I highly doubt he could get fractions like that again. It just means he didn't have any challenge whatsoever, so consequently he had plenty in the tank left. And, you look at that percentage energy for a horse on the lead, it's outstanding. So he wasn't running against much. This is a horse with talent, without a doubt, but to expect that he would have that kind of trip again in the Belmont, I think, is highly unlikely. So we look at his average and sustained pace. It is certainly above average, and that third fraction is just ridiculous at 55. So consequently, he gets a 4.61. And I'm going to add 1 back in because this is a talented horse, and it is possible for him to move forward. I just wonder if it's too much too soon. We got to remember, Mike Rapoli's been throwing the kitchen sink at any horse. They break their maiden, he was putting him into a graded stakes all along the Derby trail, and most of them washed out. This one may be the exception. He certainly seems like he has the makings of a special horse, but it is awful early in his career for this big a challenge, and he has not faced a lot of competition, and I kind of tend to like him a little saltier than this. So we look at our pace numbers, and here are the projected times for all 10, and you see in blue the best ones, the Wine Steward, Antiquarian, and Mindframe. And we have to remember, those are based on a mile and an eighth, or in Mindframe's case, a mile and a 16th. So it is logical that they would be faster than those that were based on longer distances, like the Preakness or the Kentucky Derby. So you see the ones that were lower, probably, I would guess, Dornoch certainly came out about as expected. Anna Marie, I think, can run better than that. Obviously, he was hampered by some trouble in the Kentucky Derby. Resilience is probably the one that's the most concerning to me, because he ran a really good race and just didn't have enough in the tank late. So That number is probably his projected time is probably the most accurate. I think Dornoch can run a little better, but there's just other issues with Dornoch. So those are the projected times for your perusal. And then we take a look at the average and sustained pace. And as I've mentioned before, the reason we take a look at these is because horses who generally lead in the average and sustained pace categories win the Kentucky Derby. Now, this is the same distance as the Derby, 1.25 miles. So it's important those horses who are in and amongst the leaders, and you see Protective is the one who leads. Now, there's, I mean, it would be, there's other factors certainly to consider, but I think it's highly unlikely that Protective is going to win the Belmont. However, at least it gives you the idea that he's a horse you can probably use with confidence at a price. So our top ones are the Wine Steward, Antiquarian, Protective. And you see Sierra Leone is one of the leaders in average pace, but not in sustained. It's not, but it's not separating by a whole lot. And obviously, this is why we have all four factors to consider, all four, fierceness, lead, and speed for the Kentucky Derby and what happened. So it's just things to consider when you're evaluating the horses. And so these are the average and sustained pace as they look. And you have the early fractions as well. And what that'll usually give you an idea of the second call, where the horses will stack up. And so then for finally the scores as we have them, and you see the leader was Mindframe. And that wouldn't be a surprise with that race. The pace fractions are just out of whack. And again, I don't expect he'll be able to do that, not in this quality of field. You see in second and third are Antiquarian and the Wine Steward. And, of course, the ones at the bottom are Dornoch, Mystic Dan, and Resilience. To me, as I mentioned, Dornoch and Resilience probably the ones most troubling. Resilience in particular. Dornoch was sort of expected. So those are the pace numbers. And I think in some respects, it's not quite as clear-cut as it was for the Derby because you have some of these were being judged on races that were longer at classic distances like the Preakness or the Derby for their pace numbers, whereas the others were at shorter distances like the Peter Pan. So you have to take that into account, but it does give you an idea of how the horses are running. And in particular, how efficiently they're running. And so hopefully you can get something out of this. We are going to have our final assessment coming along in the very near future, so be on the lookout for that. And, of course, we'll have postings all through the Belmont Festival of Racing. So stay tuned to Right at the Wire, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.